Osama bin Laden was born in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia in 1957. He was one of many children in a wealthy family. His father, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, was a construction magnate with close ties to the Saudi royal family. This afforded Osama a privileged upbringing with access to the best education and opportunities. However, even in his youth, there were signs of the extremism that would come to define his life. Bin Laden was deeply religious and drawn to a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. He was reportedly quiet and introspective as a young man. Some accounts describe him as deeply affected by the death of his father in a helicopter crash when bin Laden was just 10 years old. While he enjoyed a luxurious lifestyle, he was also exposed to the teachings of radical Islamist thinkers. These thinkers advocated for a return to a purer form of Islam and the expulsion of Western influence from Muslim lands. This resonated with bin Laden, who came to view the West, particularly the United States, as a corrupting force in the Muslim world. Despite his wealth and privilege, bin Laden felt a growing sense of injustice and anger toward the West. He saw the plight of Muslims suffering under Soviet occupation in Afghanistan and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as evidence of Western oppression. This sense of grievance, combined with his religious convictions, set him on a path towards militancy. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 would prove to be a turning point in his life, providing the catalyst for his transformation from a wealthy scion to a jihadist leader. The Soviet-Afghan War was a defining moment for Osama bin Laden. He answered the call to jihad, traveling to Afghanistan in the early 1980s to join the resistance against the Soviet Union. There, he used his personal wealth and connections to support the Mujahideen fighters. He helped to finance their operations, provided them with logistical support, and even took part in some battles himself. It was during this time that bin Laden honed his skills as a military strategist and leader. More significantly, Afghanistan provided the fertile ground for bin Laden's radical ideology to take root and flourish. He was surrounded by like-minded individuals, many of whom shared his vision of a global jihad against the West. He formed close relationships with key figures in the Islamist movement, including Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian scholar considered to be the godfather of global jihad. Together, they established a network of training camps in Afghanistan and Pakistan, attracting recruits from across the Muslim world. These camps, known as maktabs, provided ideological and military training to young men eager to fight for their beliefs. They instilled in their recruits a deep hatred for the West and a willingness to die for the cause. Bin Laden played a key role in developing the curriculum and ideology taught at these camps. He preached a message of violence and martyrdom, arguing that it was the duty of every Muslim to fight against the enemies of Islam. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989 was a victory for the Mujahideen, but for bin Laden it was only the beginning. He saw the potential for a global jihad, one that would target not just the Soviet Union, but also the United States and its allies. The experience in Afghanistan had a profound impact on bin Laden. He returned to Saudi Arabia a changed man, radicalized and determined to continue his fight against what he perceived as the enemies of Islam. However, his criticism of the Saudi government's close ties to the West led to his expulsion from the country. He eventually found refuge in Sudan, where he continued to build his network and resources. It was during this period that bin Laden formally established Al-Qaeda in 1988. The name Al-Qaeda translates to the base or the foundation in Arabic. It was a fitting name for the organization bin Laden envisioned, one that would serve as a base for global jihad. Al-Qaeda was not a traditional hierarchical organization, but rather a loosely affiliated network of cells and individuals spread across the globe. This decentralized structure made it difficult to track and dismantle. Bin Laden's wealth and connections allowed him to finance the organization's operations. At its core, Al-Qaeda's ideology was based on a radical interpretation of Islam that called for the establishment of a global caliphate through violent jihad. Bin Laden and his followers believed that the Muslim world was under attack by the West and that it was their duty to defend Islam by any means necessary. They targeted both civilian and military targets, justifying their actions as a response to Western aggression. Al-Qaeda's ideology resonated with a small but significant number of Muslims around the world who were drawn to its message of resistance and its promise of a glorious afterlife for martyrs. In 1996, Osama bin Laden issued his first fatwa, or religious edict, declaring war on the United States. This marked a significant escalation in bin Laden's campaign against the West. He cited the continued presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War and US support for Israel as justification for his declaration. Bin Laden viewed the stationing of US troops in the land of the two holy mosques Mecca and Medina as a grave provocation and an act of war against Islam. He called on his followers to target American interests worldwide, both civilian and military. This fatwa was followed by another in 1998, this time co-signed by Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, who would later become bin Laden's deputy in al-Qaeda. This second fatwa, titled World Islamic Front for Jihad Against Jews and Crusaders, reiterated the call for attacks against Americans and their allies. It specifically identified the American soldiers who were stationed in the Arabian Peninsula as legitimate targets, accusing them of occupying the lands of Islam in the holiest of places, the Arabian Peninsula, plundering its riches, dictating to its rulers, humiliating its people, terrorizing its neighbors, and turning its bases in the peninsula into a spearhead through which to fight the neighboring Muslim peoples. These declarations of war were not empty threats. Al-Qaeda, under bin Laden's leadership, began to plan and execute a series of increasingly audacious attacks against American targets. The bombings of the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, which killed 224 people, were a clear demonstration of the group's capabilities and its willingness to inflict mass casualties. These attacks, along with the bombing of the USS Cole in Yemen in 2000, served as a prelude to the horrors that would unfold on September 11, 2001. The 1998 US embassy bombings in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, were a watershed moment in al-Qaeda's campaign of terror. The attacks, carried out nearly simultaneously, demonstrated the group's global reach and its ability to inflict mass casualties. The bombings killed 224 people, including 12 Americans, and injured thousands more. They also marked a significant escalation in al-Qaeda's tactics, moving from symbolic attacks to large-scale acts of terrorism aimed at inflicting maximum damage. The US responded to the embassy bombings with cruise missile strikes against al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan and a suspected chemical weapons factory in Sudan. However, these strikes did little to disrupt al-Qaeda's operations. Bin Laden, now operating from a remote location in Afghanistan under the protection of the Taliban regime, continued to plan and inspire attacks against the West. In October 2000, al-Qaeda struck again, this time targeting the USS Cole, a US Navy destroyer docked in the port of Aden, Yemen. The attack, carried out by suicide bombers in a small boat packed with explosives, killed 17 American sailors and injured dozens more. The Cole bombing further exposed the growing threat posed by al-Qaeda and its ability to strike American targets both at home and abroad. It also highlighted the limitations of the US government's ability to track and prevent such attacks. The attacks of the late 1990s and early 2000s were a clear indication that al-Qaeda was a formidable and determined enemy, one that would stop at nothing to achieve its goals. The world was now on notice. Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda had declared war, and they were prepared to fight it on a global scale. The stage was set for the deadliest terrorist attack in history.